2005. I am Jessica Clark, the Teresa Mack Germans from Russia History Fellow and the Project Coordinator for the Germans from Russia Oral History Project. It is a pleasure to visit with Dr. Calvin Fercho in Fargo, North Dakota. For the introduction, will you please state your full name, date, and location of birth?
Calvin K. Fercho. I was born in Bismarck, North Dakota, September the 29th, 1925, and spent the first 11 years of my life at Lair, North Dakota, and then moved to Fargo and have basically lived in Fargo ever since then, except for my time in Chicago and Grand Forks for continuing education.
Why did your family move to Fargo?
My family moved to Fargo because my father had been a Republican appointed postmaster. In those days, every time the administration changed, all postmasters in the United States basically lost their job, and the new party nominated another postmaster. So in 1934, he was without a job, and many people were leaving the Plains areas at that time, moving to California, moving to Michigan. We moved to Fargo, where my father found sort of a job.
Yeah, the dirty 30s.
That was the dirty 30s.
Let's see. Did your parents or any relatives ever share a story about your birth with you?
Not really. We were one of the few families that would leave the town of Lair and go to Bismarck, 80 miles away. Most of my friends and so forth were born in Lair, probably with a midwife, since that was the more customary thing at that. But as I understand, I was just an ordinary arrival in Bismarck, North Dakota.
What is your earliest memory that you have from your childhood?
That is a difficult question. I have a number of memories that go, I would say, in my age group of, say, from about 6 to 10. Some of the memories that I have are church-centered, as an example. And I remember the construction of a new church and how the work was divided. Some people that had money gave money. If you didn't have money, you donated labor. And one thing I remember very much about church, because for us it was always a very important thing, and was the seating in the church. The families did not sit together. On the right-hand side of the church, the little boys sat in front so they could be watched. Then right behind the little boys were the old men. And then after the old men were the middle-aged men, and then at the back of that side of the church were like the 20-year-old men. Then they also had the women's side. Little, like 8, 10-year-old girls sat in front, and then the old grandmothers, and then the middle-aged women, and in the back would be the young women with their little babies.
Okay.
And that's how it was structured, with the half of the service in German and half of the service in English.
What church did you attend?
That was an evangelical church at that time. It was a Methodist offshoot at one time, which later on joined up with the United Brethren to become the Evangelical United Brethren, and eventually they rejoined the Methodist Church again.
Were you baptized?
I was baptized in Lair, as usual, about at the age of 6 weeks.
Okay. How about confirmation? Did you go through confirmation?
The confirmation was when I was in Fargo, because I arrived here at about age 11, so that was in a church that was now an apartment house near where the old high school was on 3rd Avenue and 10th Street in Fargo by the city jail.
What was confirmation like in Fargo?
Well, we had, in our class, we probably had about 10 or 12. There was, I recall, 6 in my particular class that belonged to this church. It was a relatively small church. And many of the people were very much like ourselves. They were Germans, German-Russian people.
Was the confirmation classes in German, or did they?
This was all in English. When we moved to Fargo, the German was left behind in McIntosh and Logan counties. You know, I don't recall, but I would say basically too long.
Too long. Did you have to get up? Something I've been hearing is you have to get up and read a few.
You'd have to go up and give some verses that you had memorized, your favorite verses, and you were asked questions which, since he didn't want you to have the wrong answers, they usually gave you the questions also that you were to answer in front of the congregation.
Was that pretty nerve-wracking for you, or did
I don't recall. I don't think it was difficult for me to do. I had worse things that happened to me in my life than memorizing a Bible verse.
Did you go to church? Your family go to church every Sunday?
We went to church Sunday morning. Then we had what they call like youth hour, like at 5 or 6 o'clock, and then we stayed for the evening service on Sundays, and we went on Wednesdays.
Okay. Was Sunday after church? Was Sunday dinner different than the normal dinner for the week? Did you do something special?
Sunday dinner was always the big meal of the week. It was almost universally like a pot roast that Mother had put into the oven, and which we ate when we went home. Another thing I remember about that particular church was that there was a great deal of visiting after the service because people who hadn't seen each other for a week or two, that was a sort of a social gathering. And I do remember when I was in high school, we had soldiers in Fargo, and we almost always took somebody home, a stranger with us, to have our Sunday meal with us.
After you're going back to your confirmation, after you had confirmation, did your family have a celebration for you at home? Or?
No, we don't. There were very few celebrations at that time. Very few birthday parties. In fact, I don't remember a birthday party ever when I was a child growing up.
What about the other holidays, such as Christmas?
Christmas was a very big function at our home. My parents rather extended themselves as much as they could, but there was, if you received a toy, maybe, you were more likely to receive a sweater, something to wear, and maybe just one gift of that kind.
Something more practical.
And it was always practical.
Did you have a Christmas tree?
We always had Christmas trees. Christmas trees were that was a definite part of Christmas. We still do Christmas trees the same way as I did when I was a youngster.
How do you decorate them, and when did you usually put them out?
We always still use the same conventions we did then, and we use the old attached decorations and with tinsel hanging down, and we're very conventional that way. My father is, and I don't want to give the impression that the emphasis is too much on religion here, but my father, we had a custom, and when I grew up, my father always read the second chapter of Luke, which is the Christmas story. And we follow that right now in our home, and just before we open up gifts, we read the second chapter of Luke, which is a Christmas story, and then go on with our gift giving, which now has an atrocious amount of gifts under the tree for the grandchildren.
Sounds like a nice family tradition. Very nice family tradition. Did your family do anything to celebrate Christmas Eve?
Christmas Eve was always spent at the church, and that following the church, we would come home and then open up our gifts.
What did the Christmas meal usually consist of?
Christmas meal was always turkey or goose, whatever we might have available at that time.
What about Easter?
Easter, of course, is a very important holiday, very important religious holiday, and I think we just did the usual church situation at that time.
Okay. What about 4th of July?
Fourth of July was a big holiday for the German Russians. I remember my dad would take some flags and attach them to the car. We would go to Green Lake or someplace within 10, 15 miles for a picnic. And we any spare money we had, we invested in firecrackers, which were, in retrospect, horribly dangerous for what we did with them. In fact, I remember my cousin, when we put a firecracker into a bottle, the bottle exploded, and the piece of glass cut him above the eye. And as an eye surgeon, I keep thinking what a terrible thing that would have been. In fact, speaking of that, one of my very vivid recollections was I had jobs to do when I was like 9 and 10 years old. One job I had to do was to take some cows out into the country and watch them during the day and return them again in the evening. And when I was out there one time with my pony kicked me in the face, knocked me unconscious, and then my friend had to go into town, pick up my father, tell my father about it. They came out, got me out of the field, took me in, and I still have the scar above my eye. And again, as a retired eye surgeon, I think to myself how close I came to losing my eye, because I had similar injuries in patients, and they did lose their eye.
Speaking of injuries, were there any other injuries while you were growing up to you or your family members?
No, nothing of any significance. Other jobs, as I say, that I recall as a youngster, we had to do things. Every morning I took a group of cows out. I was maybe 9 years old, and I'd take them about 3/4 of a mile out of town and bring them back again in the evening. I remember there was an old cow I used to ride, so I didn't have to walk all that distance. And I also helped my grandfather. All his farming was done with horses. And I helped my grandfather. I was driving a wagon or so for harvesting when I was 9 and 10 years old. Nowadays, my children are worried that they're going to hurt themselves as they use a lawnmower.
So, which grandfather is this on which side of the family?
That was my mother's father. That I spent a great deal of time with him. And just as you asked me if I do remember things from my childhood, some things are coming back. And this was the dirty 30s. This was the poor dirty 30s. This was the Dust Bowl dirty 30s. And I remember my grandfather as an example of how poor people got. He asked me one time, "Calvin, do you have $2? He says, "I need to get my car fixed." So he didn't have $2, but I had $2 in a piggy bank, and I gave it to him so that he could get his car fixed. So these are things that come to me from, I say, my life sort of almost, it changed entirely when I moved from the German-Russian community of Lair, North Dakota, to the English-speaking Fargo, North Dakota, where I started the 6th grade.
The transition from rural country life to urban life.
It's very, and it was not easy either. We dressed differently a little bit than the children in town. I remember I had a pair of overalls on, clean of course, the first day I went to school, and people teased me. But that's the way we dressed in Lair, but it was not the way they dressed in Fargo.
Did it take a while then for you to be accepted in Fargo?
Yes, but I managed that without any problem.
Going back to your grandfather, were you close to both sets of grandparents?
I was very close to my maternal grandparents because they lived in Lair.
Okay.
My paternal grandparents lived in Napoleon, North Dakota, and we would maybe visit them 2-3 times a year.
Were your maternal grandparents, were they farmers as well?
He was a farmer, yes, they were farmers.
And did you, since you lived...
They were all farmers, basically, until our generation.
Good point. Can you describe their characters to me?
My grandfather was a very nice person. He was very patient with me. I went with him all summer. I would spend most of my time with him. He had a very nice relationship with his wife, and And I sort of, as we recall now, one thing I remember is and this would be the Saturday bath. Well, I lived through the era when a wash tub was filled with water, and then the Grandpa would bathe first, and then we'd go right down the line in the same tub of water, and I think, till the little ones, and I think that's where the expression came out, don't throw the baby out with the bath water.
I never thought about it that way. That could be.
That's where the expression
Yeah.
came from. Because by the time the baby got in there, it wasn't as great anymore.
Yeah. Huh. I never knew that. How about your paternal grandparents?
As I say, they were retired farm people, poor. After you left the farm there, you probably didn't own the farm anymore because of the bad economic situations, and they moved into Napoleon and lived in a small house there till the time that they died. But I really never spent very much time with them.
Okay. Did you ever stay the night at either of your grandparents' houses?
Oh, I stayed the night at my maternal grandparents a number of times. They had adequate room, and I stayed there because I spent a great deal of time with them.
How was that for you, staying with your grandparents?
Well, I just always got along very nicely with my grandparents.
Good. Did they attend the same church as you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. How many children did your maternal grandparents have?
My maternal grandmother, they had 5 daughters, which is an economic disaster for a farmer.
Yes.
And the last one just died about 2-3 weeks ago at age 97.
Long life.
No.
So, did they all stay within the Lair region when they married, or?
There was a rather dispersion of families in the 1930s. We moved to Fargo. My mother was the oldest. The second oldest moved to California. The third one moved to Michigan. The fourth one moved to Michigan. The fifth one moved to Michigan. So, but because there was nothing to do there, they went away. They found husbands elsewhere and never returned again to Lair to live.
Are any of them still in the farming business?
No, none of them were farmers after they left, no.
What about your paternal side? How many children did they have?
My father was one of 10 children.
Did they disperse the same way, or did they have?
They dispersed from, they went to California, they went to Canada, they went to the state of Washington. About half of them remained in North Dakota.
Were you close to any of your aunts and uncles?
I was close to my Uncle John, who farmed south of Lair. I was close to several of my cousins. One of my cousins that I was probably most close to was a physician, Ralph Ternaski, who practiced in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Did you socialize with them a lot when you were children?
As children, we socialized a lot with relatives, very much.
Did you have family celebrations at your house? Would they come over for like Christmas and stuff, or would you go to theirs?
No, I don't recall. The family sort of stayed by themselves for those holidays. I don't remember big family gatherings for that like we have now. We more or less, each family stayed by itself.
Okay. Turning to your parents, do you know where your father was born?
My father was born in Edgeley, North Dakota in 1891, May the 3rd.
Okay.
My mother was born in Lair on May 20th, 1902.
Can you describe your father's character to me?
My father was a soft-spoken, gentle man, not one to lose his temper, very honest, totally honest individual, hardworking, non-drinking. Uh, Excellent example for his sons. My parents believed in education. My mother was the driver of the family. Uh, Education-wise, my mother had 1 year at Ellendale Normal School, preparing for teaching, which she never did. My father went like to the 3rd grade, and then maybe to the 6th grade, and then to the 9th grade, and then to business college. I mean, you didn't go to school every year those years. If you were the oldest boy, you were expected to help on the farm. But they were very education conscious, so that all 4 of us, I had 3 brothers, and we all graduated from college. But that was very important to my parents, is furthering the education.
Did they read a lot to you at home, or encourage you to read books?
We were always encouraged to read, but we didn't have much to read at home. A few things, but not many books. Maybe 1 magazine, maybe 1 weekly newspaper, but that was but when we moved to Fargo, I spent a great deal of time in the public library.
When you were out in Laird, did they encourage you to read stuff in English or in German?
My family encouraged everything in English. Although I might catch my parents speaking German with each other, they never spoke German to us. Our communication with our parents was always in English. We were maybe a half a generation ahead of some of the others in the city in that way.
You had mentioned while we were setting up your great-grandmother. Were you close to your great-grandmother?
No, my great-grandmother was a very prim, proper, old German lady who walked around in her long black dresses and with a very dour face.
Was she your only great relative that was still living during your childhood?
Yes, and she died when I was maybe 8, 9 years old. So I really didn't know her very well, other than the fact she never said 1 word of English to anybody. So we had to speak German to her if we wanted to talk to her.
So could you fluently speak German as a child?
I still speak German.
So
Yes, it was bilingual. And you have to understand the German of that era was not a German that was a true German, a good German. If you came to a word that you didn't know in German and knew it in English, you just threw the English word into the same sentence and continued, you know.
Do you have any memories of visiting your great-grandmother, or?
Not very much, because that just really wasn't done. I remember coming to their home, and she had her own home, and I remember that. But I say it was my grandmother that I spent most of my time with.
How old was your great-grandmother when she passed away?
To me, she seemed very old, but I'm going to say she must have been probably 70s, 80s. You know, I don't think she was ancient. She wasn't in a nursing home, because they didn't have nursing homes those days. You always stayed with one of the children till you died. Then they got the house for taking care of Grandma.
Going back to your parents, can you describe your mom and dad's relationship with each other?
They had an enviable relationship. I don't ever remember any serious argument. I don't remember one being really angry with the other. They were very peaceful with each other. And as I say, I don't think any of their children achieved the same degree of harmony with their wives as they did with each other.
You said there was 4 of you, 4 sons?
I had an older brother and 2 younger brothers that are identical twins.
Really? And how much older, how much younger?
My oldest brother was 4.5 years older. He was born June 9th, 1921, and my younger brothers were born March 11th, 1931. So there's about 5 years difference between us.
And what are their names?
My older brother was named Lloyd Irvin. Now, Irvin you would never catch anymore today, but that was a very popular name at that time. I myself, my name came from Calvin Coolidge, the president. My father was a Republican postmaster at that time, so I think at that time it was sort of nice to name a son after, if you were a postmaster, after the president, which happened to me. My younger brothers were named after their grandfathers, or after their father. One is Frederick Rodney, the other one is John Roger. The John being after both grandparents were named John, so that's John is one of our rather family names.
Great. How did your parents relate to you children? Did you have a close relationship with your parents?
We had a close relationship, but a lot of our relationships were dependent upon my parents' activities. My father worked at night for a long time, so he slept during the day. And although we were always in sports and things like that, my parents hardly ever had the opportunity to attend any of the games. Much different than it is now. And but we had good parents, real good parents.
You mentioned playing sports. What sports did you play?
I played 2 years on the state championship basketball team at Fargo Central. My older brother played 1 year on the state championship team at Fargo Central. My two twin brothers played basketball at Fargo Central and at North Dakota State. All three of my brothers played basketball at North Dakota State University.
Okay.
I myself didn't play any college sports, and we all played baseball.
How did your parents show affection towards your children?
Toward our children?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't recall my father being, he was affectionate, but not, you might say, physically affectionate. One thing I do remember, though, is you have to understand the way we lived, the way we grew up. All four of the boys slept in one room in the basement of our home. The upper part of the house was always rented out to other people for extra income. So we slept. The twins slept on one side of the room. My older brother and I slept in a bed on the other side of the room. And one thing I do remember is that my mother sang a lullaby to my younger brothers every night when they went to bed.
Do you remember that lullaby?
It went something like, Guten Abend, gute Nacht, mit Rosen bedacht, da 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 da, morgen früh, wenn Goodwill. I don't remember it all, but that's how it goes, something like that.
Is this when you're living out in Lair or when you're living in Fargo?
Both.
Both. Can you describe the house in Lair for me?
The house is square. It's probably about 35 feet by 35 feet in diameter. It has a living room, dining room combination now, but at that time it was separate. And then you see, when we grew up, we were not allowed in the living room. That was off limits. That was only used for Sundays and guests, not for us at any other time. We slept in the attic, and who's that? And or in the summertime, and in the winter we slept in the basement. When we moved to Fargo, we all slept out in the front porch in the summertime, and when it got so cold, the snow came, then we'd move from the open porch down to the basement again.
What was your house like in Fargo?
Our house in Fargo was not a large house. It had a small living room, dining room, kitchen on the main floor. Then we had 2 small apartments upstairs that we rented out, and we slept in the basement again. I was in college before I knew that you could sleep anywhere besides a basement.
The furniture. What was the furniture like in your house?
Ordinary, I'd say. Ordinary. The living room's furniture stayed rather unused and new looking forever because it was never used. Practical. Nothing fancy, because furniture, you only bought what you needed, not what you wanted.
When you moved from Lair to Fargo, did your family bring a lot of their furniture with them to their new house?
We would bring whatever we had. I still have some of the things that came from that house, came to Fargo, like some pictures and stuff, and now they're back in Lair again in the same house that when I grew up, I just moved them back again to that same house.
Oh, that's great. That's right, you were saying that you had bought that, you just recently bought your childhood home?
Well, I bought it 7 years ago.
7 years ago. Great. Um, can you describe the other buildings on your farm in Lair? What were
We
the
see
other
now we did
buildings?
not live on a farm.
Oh, okay.
We lived in the city.
In the city?
My
Oh, okay.
father
So
was the
you all-
postmaster. We lived in the city.
Okay.
It's my relatives that lived in the farms. Although I did have an uncle who was was the rural mail carrier.
Okay. So then how was the town set up where you lived? Where was your house located compared to other things in the town?
Well, first of all, the town is not very large, so we were 1 block off Main Street and 1 block from the edge of town. You see, so, and the house was located on Highway 13 and another major highway, but that just the houses are very ordinary. You know, they're not anything special.
What businesses were in town?
In the 1930s, communities of that size had multiple businesses. They had a large grocery store, which was a hub of activity every Saturday as the people came in to buy. They had 2 car dealerships in the beginning. They had service stations. They had a lumber yard. They had a hardware store, a post office, a bank, all on Main Street. Now they have 1 bar on Main Street, 1 bank, and 1 senior center cafe, a plumbing and heating establishment, and that's about the extent of what's left on Main Street, rural North Dakota, 2005.
It's kind of the traditional thing you've seen with the small towns. They're dying off, slowly dying off.
They're all dying out.
Did your town have a fountain shop where you could go and get ice cream or sodas, like soda drinks?
At one time, early in the 1920s, my father actually owned a sort of a store, like a drugstore. But when that closed, I don't recall any place that had like a fountain or so. We had a cousin in Gackle that had a drugstore with a fountain, and we loved to go through Gackle, North Dakota, because every time we did, he'd fix us up with the greatest soda that you ever saw.
Okay. Turning to life on the prairie, we just talked about how towns are dying off. What was it like growing up on the prairie? What was the environment like?
Well, I'm assuming you mean prairie it relates to me growing in a small town. Because of my interaction with my grandfather, I was very close to the agricultural aspect of the Depression and the lack of moisture at that time. There were no crops grown for about 4 or 5 years. The land was blowing in dust storms. Thistles were the only things that would grow. Thistles were used for hay, and I remember helping my grandfather work at that time, because, like I say, his daughters weren't of any help to him. His 10-year-old grandson was his helper.
Can you describe the winter months? What was winter like growing up in a rural town?
Winter was sometimes like fun time, because you could do things that you couldn't do. You could sled. There's always a little hill around that you could go. And as I recall, we didn't have skates or skis or so, but sleds would be our activity. But I've always been under the impression that snow and children go together, just as much, probably as much as grass and children go together.
What were the summer months like for you?
Well, I spent a great deal of time again with my grandfather, almost on a daily activity. I followed him. out on the farm. Many times I didn't do anything, I just was along. But one thing that came to my mind and that I remember is that we'd go out where we had this farm about 3 miles out of town. And it would take us an hour to get out there because by horse and wagon, it takes you an hour to travel 3 miles. But very specific, I remember we didn't carry water or anything with us, but there was an old well on this land, and when we got thirsty, Grandpa would take a bucket, drop it down, and if there were something like a garter snake or bugs on there, he'd just pour it out, and then we'd drink the water. Never got sick. I don't know. We'd never think of that nowadays, but that's the way we did it.
Make do with what you can.
Make do with what we had.
Since you grew up in the town, were you very close to your neighbors? Was your family close to their neighbors?
Well, of course, living in the city, we had houses across the street in all directions from us. Mm-hmm. Although the back of our home was contiguous with the business places on Main Street. Mm-hmm. You see, but we had the usual. Not very much different there than it was in any community.
Did your neighbors ever babysit you as a young child, or watch you while your parents were out?
The babysitter that we would have would be my mother's younger sister, and she would act as a babysitter. But the children went with the parents. There were no activities to bring a babysitter into the house. Children went with their parents.
What was when one of the boys acted up? How would your parents discipline them? Or you?
Well, I remember being disciplined one time by my father, only once. And we had a new minister in church, and he had a terrible German accent. And as a little boy sitting in the front, not near my father, I was laughing, and we were making fun of this minister throughout the service. And I knew on the way home that big trouble was awaiting me when we arrived at our home. And it was there in the form of a belt. A belt was used on your backside, and that's the only major discipline I ever recall receiving from my parents.
Would you say that your mom or your dad, which one was the one who would do more of the disciplining?
Mother.
Mother? What was her methods of disciplining? Was it scolding or?
I'd say it was more scolding, nothing physical. As I say, my mother was more the driver of the home. Dad did his work, but mother was sort of the leader, the dominant person in our house.
Would you describe your parents as strict or?
Not really. I think I'd call them more directive in their approach to their children, like, it's not right to do this, and you shouldn't do that, or you should do this. But no, we were allowed quite a few freedoms. I remember as a 12-year-old with a friend of mine hitchhiking to Detroit Lakes with our tent and fishing poles and going for 3 days, and our parents didn't think of anything of it. We were given a lot of freedom in that regard.
Okay. You mentioned making fun of your pastor. What was your relationship with the pastor? Were you able to?
Well, at that age, there would be no relationship whatsoever. You see, I mean, you had been baptized, and you were too young to go through confirmation, so you were in this period when you were to be seen and not heard.
When you went through confirmation, how did your relationship with the pastor or your new pastor change?
Well, by that time I was living in Fargo, mm-hmm. and going into that area, you became fairly close in this type of a church, where the church was not very large and everybody knew each other very much. You often became fairly close to the family, as you would. They were friends and your pastor, whereas the situation we have now, they just are they don't communicate much with the people in the church.
Back in Lair, how many animals did you have? Did you have cows or?
We had one cow because that's what we used for our milk. Everybody had a cow, and some people had more than one cow, but I still recall I think we only had one or two, just enough for our needs for our family.
Did you have any other animals?
A dog,
Dog? What was that?
a pony.
A pony. Was the dog used as a family pet, or was it used for other purposes?
No, that was it was sort of a pet. I think I never really had a dog except when I would maybe pick up a stray in May and abandon him again in October.
Earlier you spoke about you hunt now. Did you hunt when you were a child? Did you go out hunting?
I've always been close to guns, and probably started when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I was a little bit too young in Lair because I was not, but when I moved to Fargo, yes, hunting and guns and rifles and so forth. We'd walk right out of Fargo and shoot a pheasant or something like that. So I've always done that. It's just been sort of second nature to me.
Did you go on any hunting trips with your brothers or your father? Or?
My father was very severely wounded in World War I and never touched a gun again the rest of his life.
Where did he serve?
And my three other brothers didn't hunt at all. I was the only one of the four. My father served in France.
Exactly. What was your relationship like with your brothers?
Had a good relationship with my brothers. Always did. Still do. As I say, my older brother died about 18 years ago. And I have a brother that lives in Arizona, comes to Minnesota in the summer, and I have a brother that lives in Houston. And my brother and I in Houston, we call each other every 2-3 weeks. Yesterday morning he called me, and we sort of visit and see how things are going along, and we have a good family relationship.
What was it like growing up with out in Lair with your brothers? Did you guys get into some mischief, or?
You always get into some mischief when you're 10 years old in a small town. I mean, this is second nature. I remember one time in the 30s they were collecting metal, like iron and aluminum and so forth. And I remember one time mischief I got into. The neighbor had a copper wash tub, which I thought would be nice to sell to the local junk dealer, which I did to be as scrap copper. And I remember I think my father and I had to somehow work up to get paid $2 for that wash tub. I remember that's just one example of mischief that I recall.
What type of activities would you guys do for fun?
We had our evening games in that little town. When the 9 o'clock came, a curfew rang in the town, and everybody at a certain age had to go be home off the streets at 9 o'clock. But until that time, we'd play. A lot of the games were sort of like a hide-and-seek type of game that you could spread over a block or two. And we played baseball, played some baseball, things like that. Football was unknown to us at that time, but the only sports we knew were basketball and baseball.
Did you have a favorite place that you would go to play at in the town, or would you mostly play in your yard in the house?
You play wherever you can find something to play with, and I know one place that we played sort of a danger was the stockyards, where they brought the cattle in to put them on the train to send them away, and they're about 6 feet tall, the railings, so the cattle don't get away, and maybe an 8 or 9 inch plank on the top. And one of the things we did is we'd run all over that, and I guess our parents would hope we wouldn't be falling and breaking our legs, but we were given a lot of freedom that way.
Who did you primarily play with as a child?
I had the usual friends, 2, 3 friends. One of them was actually a cousin of my mother's, of the same age as I was, and they lived at the edge of town, and they were farmers, so we had all the farm activities there. And then I had several friends in town that we were friendly with. It was entirely different, I think, at that time. We didn't spend. I remember sleeping over at his house actually once or twice also, which was a real big deal at that time.
What was that like for you?
Well, he had a bigger house, a fancier house, and that's always sort of nice to do that, you know.
What type of things would you do when you would spend the night over there?
We didn't watch television.
A little different than today's sleepovers.
We didn't have a radio either, you see. And we didn't have a bathroom either, you see, so you had to carry all those conveniences with you. So what did we do? I suppose we read, played games.
Did you, what type of card games, or did you play card games?
We didn't play card games in our house. I think cards, dancing, liquor were sort of no-nos when I grew up.
Okay.
We didn't do that at our home.
Did you have board games, or did you just do outdoor games where you played?
I don't even recall board games, but there was somewhere along the line that checkers and Chinese checkers and some of those things, but I don't remember anything Monopoly-like or anything like that. I just think that was before that time.
Okay. You've talked about hide and seek and baseball and basketball. Were there any other outdoor activities that you used to play as a kid?
Sledding in the wintertime. Sledding in the wintertime. Really, I can't think of anything much more than that because we just didn't do those things those days.
Did your parents play with you when you were doing some of these activities? Would they participate in them? Or?
Not really. Not really. It was all children. No, the parents didn't participate with the children in any outdoor activities or anything.
Did you join any clubs as a child? Any type of clubs like 4-H or we have Boy Scouts or things like that?
Going back to my time at Laird, those things were not in evidence at that time.
Okay.
When we came to Fargo, it was different. I think I was a scout for maybe a year or so, and then no longer did that.
Do you have any favorite childhood stories, like bedtime stories that were told to you, or fairy tales, such as like one that comes to mind is Little Red Riding Hood for me. But do you have any of those that were told to you as a child?
No, I don't. I don't remember anything like that.
Okay. How about any rhymes or sayings that you grew up with?
Well, one local custom at the time, I don't recall anything being related to Halloween, but we did have a New Year's custom. And the custom then was for, and I don't know what age this stopped, but I think it would maybe through 10, 11, or 12 we would do that. And we would knock on the door of a family, and we'd use this rhyme. I can give it to you in German if you want it in German.
That'd be great.
Ich bin ein kleiner König, gib mir nicht zu wenig. Lass mich nicht zu lange stehen, ich muss heit noch weitergehen. Which translates somewhat into, I am a little king, don't give me too little. Don't let me stand here too long. I have to go a lot of other places today.
How was New Year's celebrated? I mean, besides this...
That's the only thing I remember about New Year's.
Okay. Let's see. Did you grow up with any, knowing any jokes as a child, like favorite jokes or anything?
I don't recall any, and maybe the ones that I would recall, I probably shouldn't relate.
How about any superstitions or scary stories that you grew up with? Like, don't break the mirror, or 7 years of bad luck.
You know, I don't recall anything that, any real superstition that we had, you know. I remember one little story again, I sort of remember it in German, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great.
Wann das Wörtli wann nicht mehr, hatte ich halt $1,000 mehr, which means, and I'm not saying that very well anymore, but it means goes went like this. If it weren't for the word if, I'd have $1,000 more today. That was a big price, a lot of money to us at that time.
Yes, yes. Huh. Great one. Was there any music or entertainment in your house when you were growing up?
We had a piano.
Okay.
My older brother took piano lessons for a while. I took guitar lessons for a while, but neither one of us continued with it to any degree of accomplishment.
When you were taking these lessons, were you being taught to read music, or were you being just taught how to play?
I think the piano was with music, the guitar wasn't.
Okay. Did you have any favorite songs as a child during your childhood?
I don't recall any, speaking of that before age 11 era in Lair, North Dakota, I don't recall any songs that we would probably get accustomed to would be church songs and hymns.
Okay. Did you have a favorite hymn when you were young?
I suppose I did, but I'd have to think about it right now. I don't sing very well.
Okay.
So
we'll move on.
it went something like, Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auf mich, Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auf mich. Dann sag ich noch einmal, Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auf mich. No, I'm not,
That's great. No, that's really great.
that's the one I remember.
Earlier you had mentioned a couple playmates who, one had caught pneumonia and the other one.
One thing I remember, as I say, these were the days of limited medical facilities and treatment. And I recall this one time that my cousin on my mother's side, his cousin, and I, the three of us were playing out on a winter day, and as I recall, his cousin died of pneumonia within a week, and he developed a kidney disease, and later on died from that. And but illness was a problem at that stage. I remember one of my twin brothers being very close to death one winter from a probable pneumonia, and we just didn't do anything. The local physician we had was limited in his ability and twice limited by the medications available to him. This was before sulfa, before everything, before penicillin, before antibiotics.
How old were you when your two friends passed away?
Probably about 10.
Did you go to their funerals?
Well, I would have to the one, funerals were, that's another thing, a recollection I have from my childhood, and that is that I remember a friend of my mother's cousin who was killed at that time. A lot of the young men left home for the summer looking for jobs or so forth. Their transportation was the railroad. They were like hobos in effect almost. And he was killed by the train in Minneapolis. But I remember one thing they had for the funerals then was there was a sort of what they called the roof or something like that. It was a call. And they thought if they would, cry around the casket for a long time, it was trying to wake up somebody. Just a custom at the time that was present, probably there with the early Germans. And I remember some of that.
We've been looking at some of your artwork, and when did your interest in art start to?
I'm going to trace it back to 1967.
Okay.
In 1967, we went to the exhibition in Montreal, and at that time, a lot of the European countries brought their masterpieces of art there, and I sort of got interested in it and started to collect in 1972, and have maybe collected 40, 50 pieces of art that we usually look for the things that we enjoy, that we like to watch, look at, rather than looking at it as an investment or so. You know, some go up, some go down, some stay the same. But it should always be for something you'd like to look at, like that one that we looked up upstairs where the two trout fishermen are visiting at the side of a stream.
Very peaceful. Very peaceful. When you were a child, did you ever try to draw or doodle?
No, no. It's like I had a friend one time. He said you don't have to play the piano to sell pianos, and it's sort of the same way here. You don't have to draw. I think you should have an appreciation for nice things, though, and a little concept of not color, because I don't have that, but of structure within a painting.
Do you think that your likeness for nice things was instilled into you from your parents? Did they have an eye for something nice?
No, you know, we have an entirely different economic situation between the family I grew up with and the way I've lived myself.
That was just kind of a side note, so we'll move back to your childhood. You've mentioned a couple serious illnesses that you have experienced. Do you remember where you would go for help with a serious illness? Would you?
The town of Lair had a doctor, and but in almost every little town in North Dakota would have a doctor. It would seem that some of these small towns were sort of a stopping off place for doctors who probably had been somewhere else first. I think our doctor was called Dr. Barrett or so, and they often had some problems, but there were a lot of little family doctors around at that time.
What types of things would the doctors do since it was before penicillin and before the prescriptions that we have nowadays? So what type of things would
Well, first of all, you'd have probably attendance at a birth of a child for maternity. Things would be one. Taking care of injuries, local injuries that occurred just like they did for myself. A lot of it was almost like a little bedside hand holding.
You weren't born in a home, but you've mentioned midwives and that your friends were. Did you hear any stories about?
No, I don't recall. The only medical thing I had a grandmother, my paternal grandmother, and she was a sort of a doctor. But she did a lot with tea leaves and things like that. She was a sort of a homeopathic type of individual. But I don't know very much about her, but just those things I heard about her.
Did your parents have any home remedies for you when you would get like a stomach ache or the flu? Did they have anything?
We had some things. I remember that if you had an infection or something like that, Mother would take a concoction of flour and something else that she'd put in it, and they'd wrap it around this infection, and it would sort of draw out the infectious material out of the wound. I remember that. But it seems like we didn't get treated for many things. I don't ever remember going anywhere for dental care, and I don't remember going anywhere for medical care for any of us in the family.
Did you have any eye care as a child? Did you have?
No, my first thing was when I couldn't see the blackboard, and I was a sophomore in high school and found out I needed glasses for my nearsightedness and my myopia.
Was that common for children your age to seek help when they started to lose their eyesight? Or?
Well, it's the same thing then that it is now. When you don't see, they take you to the doctor and he gives you a pair of glasses. It's been that way for many years.
Okay. Where was the closest doctor's office in comparison to your house? Since you lived in town, was it fairly?
Where, in which
in
city?
Lair?
Well, it couldn't be more than about 2 blocks away because everything was within 2 blocks.
Yeah. And then what about when you moved to Fargo?
In Fargo, we had a family doctor, and but I don't recall really ever seeing a doctor for any illness of mine. The only thing I remember is when my father had an accident or so, and being a World War I veteran, he always went to the Veterans Hospital.
You said your father was injured in World War I. You want to talk a little bit about that?
My father uh, enlisted in the, I don't know, remember if he was drafted or volunteered in about April 1918. On September the 26th, 1918, he was seriously wounded in the Aragon forest and was left on the battlefield for several days because they thought his wounds were too severe. But finally some buddy of his brought him in, and he had shrapnel wounds to both arms that were badly infected, and they were even considered amputation of both of his arms. He eventually recovered from these injuries, spent about a year in a hospital, and but it instilled in him a very patriotic sense which he tried to pass on to his sons, that patriotism was very important in our family.
Did any of his sons serve in World War II or the Vietnam?
The oldest, my older brother and I served in World War II. He was in the Navy, I was in the Army, going over to Germany.
Do you want to talk about your experiences in World War II?
Well, I was in the Army about 2.5 years, and went in as a sort of a college student type, but then after I was there on their education system for 3 months, they decided that they needed replacements for infantry casualties more than they did future officers. So most of us were sent to Army basic training and then sent on to infantry divisions. Fortunately, I didn't remain with the infantry division, went on to form a new battalion of artillery, so that by the time I got over to Europe, we were sort of at the tail end of the war. But I did get into the last 3 months of the battle in Europe, and do remember liberating at least one concentration camp. And again, I used my German at that time as an interpreter, which has its pluses and its minuses. The minus would be that the captain would ask you to go with him to do some scouting in the forward lines. The plus would be that if there were any German girls around, well, you could speak their language to them.
Do you remember what concentration camp you were?
Ordruf.
Okay. Before you were, when did you head over to Germany?
In December 1944.
Okay, so it was later on. Do you remember before you went into the Army, how World War II was affecting daily life activities in North Dakota?
Well, I think one of the way it affected was number one, there was rationing. There was rationing of sugar, rationing of gasoline, rationing of tires. And if you were in certain jobs, like if you were a doctor or so, you'd get more gas or more tires and things like that. But there was a shortage of those things. I remember that, like Lucky Strike, used to be in a certain kind of a packaging. Then they changed the packaging, and one of their sayings was, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." The toothpaste containers changed because they used to use a sort of an aluminum metal in there, and because of the war effort, they changed that into a different type of packaging. Those are the little things that sort of affected you, not in a serious way, but it was there, but you could still continue on with a decent life, except you probably couldn't go on a long automobile trip because there was no gas to do so.
How did it affect your family, your family in particular?
It didn't really affect our family. My father was a postal clerk at that time. as far as going to work, I recall I don't think he drove a car. I think he went on his bicycle to go to maybe a mile or so, a mile and a half to work. And we got along well.
Did rationing come into play with your family?
Well, rationing came into play with everybody, but my mother was very good at economy. You know, everything was economy. It didn't affect our way of living at all.
Did Christmas time change during this time? How Christmas was celebrated? Did that change at all? Or?
Well, after we moved to Fargo, the only thing I can say is that I think the gifts got a little bigger. Not much, but somewhat bigger. But again, it was still like the one gift, but maybe now you'd maybe get a better sweater instead of a smaller one, and now maybe we buy clothes instead of have the clothes made over from Dad's suits for us.
You talked about using your German language during the war. Before you went into the Army, was there any sort of discrimination against the German Russians because they were German?
Not at World War II. Not at World War II. I think we had that in North Dakota before World War I, but not at World War II. You have to remember we didn't have any settlers coming over after the early 1900s, you know, because most of the people came from between, like, say, 1880 and maybe 1910.
During your childhood, did your father and mother discuss politics while they were at home or around you?
Not really, but I presume that I guess I was born a Republican, raised a Republican, will die a Republican, because my father was a Republican postmaster.
Let's see. You grew up. Would you consider yourself a rural person or an urban person?
Urban.
Urban?
Urban.
Why?
Well, I suppose even when I lived in Lair in the town of 500, I considered myself urban rather than rural. Because a lot of my friends lived on farms. I lived in the little city. And so the rest of my life, I mean, I've lived in Fargo, I've lived in Chicago for 6 years, and with my education, and my memories of the rural go mostly to work with my grandfather and his farm.
What do you believe is better, living in a town or living in a country?
Living in a city is better, but I wouldn't want to live in a large city. I want to be able to drive to the edge of the city in 5 or 10 minutes, not in an hour, because much of my outside activity is outdoor related, from fishing, hunting, golfing, and so forth. So I like to have those things available to me.
You talked about hunting. When did you start fishing?
When the season opens, we have a lake home, and we go down and go fishing. We have our boat and all the other little things that go along with being well equipped and catching very little.
Did you fish as a child?
I remember going to the lake as a 12-year-old. A friend of mine and I were taken to the edge of Moorhead, and from there we hitchhiked to Detroit Lakes. We spent 3 days on the edge of the lake doing a little fishing, and then hitchhiking back home again.
Did you catch anything?
A few.
Did your dad or your brothers ever go fishing with you, or?
No. I was the only one in the family doing any hunting or fishing.
They didn't really get into the outdoors.
No.
Okay. Did you ever experience a feeling of isolation?
Where?
In there.
No. That's what I grew up in, and that's what I knew. If you've never had steak, you don't miss steak, you know.
Your neighbors, we've talked about them before. Before the interview, you mentioned seen a pretty traumatic event with a fire. Do you want to talk about that?
I had a favorite uncle who lived about 12 miles south of Blair, and I used to spend a lot of time there in the summertime. And I remember going out there, I'm presuming now this was during Christmas vacation, going out to the farm. And one night, about as we were getting ready to go to bed, someone noticed that there was a fire at the neighboring farm. So we had to go out and hitch the horses and get in the sled and go over to the farm. And as we got to the farm, the house was totally aflame, and a young girl was dashing out of the house. All the fire, and I think the presumed cause of the fire was candles, and it has made a lasting impression upon me of the danger of candles in a home. And I still vividly remember that scene of the person leaving the fire.
Did she die?
Yes.
But do you know how old she was?
She was a teenager. I only remember that.
Was she the only casualty in the fire?
Pardon?
Was she the only casualty in the fire?
I think there were 2 casualties.
Do you know what happened to that family after their farmstead burned down?
I don't know for sure, but those were the days when it was very difficult. There was hardly enough money to build anything, and with a catastrophe like that, maybe that was often the end of the farming situation for those people, because people were leaving their farms for less reason than that.
You talk about going over to help the neighbors. Was that a common thing to do in that time period? Would neighbors go over in cases of emergency or births or?
Well, that always has been. I think that is changing now. Farmers now are in big competition with each other generally, but those days in the 30s, you had to help out neighbors.
Let's see here. Oh yeah, did your mother and father, did they have a lot of friends besides the family?
Oh yes, yes, but much of the many of the friends were church related.
Okay.
Your closest friends were almost always in the same church that you were, because your religious life and your social life were very closely intertwined at that time.
Did the friends differ? Did your dad have different friends than your mom's friends, or were they usually
I'd say
married
no. I'd
couples?
say no. I'd say they had more couple friends.
Okay. Did they entertain their friends in your house when you were growing up, either in Lair or in Fargo?
We didn't entertain friends as much, but when we moved to Fargo, we were considered a cheap motel for anybody that was coming to visit in Fargo. Whereas we didn't even have any room. All 4 of our bedrooms were rented out to roomers and boarders. The 4 boys slept in the basement, but sometimes my parents were expected to give up their couch in the living room to people that would show up at 4 in the afternoon, would be there at dinner time, and still hadn't left at 9 o'clock. So, but that was the custom at that time, to see if you could stay with somebody rather than to do anything commercial like renting a room or so.
Talk about staying in the basement. Did each one of the boys have their own bed, or did you have to share beds with your
We had 2 beds for 4 boys. My older brother and I slept together, and the younger twin brother slept together.
What type of, did you have like really warm wool blankets, or what type of?
Well, you always have enough blankets for the conditions, and when 2 of you are sleeping in a bed, you're not quite as cold as if there's just 1 of you.
That's some body heat.
That's the body heat.
If your parents did entertain friends at home, where did they usually go to socialize with their friends outside of church?
There was very little socializing in the home. I don't really recall people coming in other than, say, like a visiting pastor or visiting minister would come over for, the proverbial chicken dinner right after the Sunday service. But I don't remember much. There was not a great deal of socializing other than that. You got together for funerals, you got together for weddings, you got together for events. But there wasn't much going house to house type of thing.
Do you remember the first time you went to a funeral?
I remember several funerals when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and generally they would be of relatives, of grandmothers or someone.
Were they pretty traumatic experiences for you as a young child?
They were, as a child. I think the customs then were different than they were now, and death has always been a bad event in a family.
Besides your two friends that died, do you remember any other young people that died?
I remember a friend of a cousin of my mother's who was killed trying to hop a freight train in Minneapolis and fell under the wheels and was killed. And I remember this very sad funeral for this 18 or 19-year-old young man. And I still remember it was out on the farm, and I can still remember all the people gathered around the casket, which seemed to be set up outside for the funeral.
Do you remember when you grew up, did different social classes exist? As far as middle class, lower class, upper class? Or did it all just seem like everybody was together?
There are always different classes. The classes, they're economic. The banker had his friends, other business people, and then there was a very poor section in the community also. There were people that had nothing, you see. We had several families in a small town that they had tuberculosis, like say in the family, 3 or 4 children would have tuberculosis. They were poor. They had minimum amount of food, minimum amount of care at home, minimum education. And so that group of people, no, they didn't socialize with the banker. In a town like that, I'd say you'd have three layers. The upper one, the lower one, the middle one. We were probably in the bottom of the upper third.
Okay. Do you know, in the town, were there any other ethnic groups besides German Russian?
No, there weren't. This was a Protestant German Russian community. There were no Catholics in the community. There was one Jewish family, and they were running the general store at one time. But there was a group of musicians. Their name was Johnson. They came and they played a gig in Lair. Well, by the time they left, 2 of the Johnson boys had taken up with 2 Lair girls, and after that we had 2 Norwegians in the community that stayed there.
How were they treated? Were they accepted?
Oh, same as everybody, no problem.
And what about the Jewish family that ran the general store? Were
Well,
they
by the time I was growing up, they'd already left, but it was quite common that, like, every town maybe would have a store or a general store, and the most likely people to do that were Jewish immigrants. They were not farmers, basically. They were merchants.
What was your family's attitude toward the farming people? Did they just generally accept them and?
Well, when you have to understand, both of my parents grew up farming. Many of our friends and their relatives were farmers. They were the same. There's no difference whatsoever.
Why did they transition into a town life when you were growing up, your mom and your dad?
Well, my father went to business college, so he started working in a bank. My mother had gone 1 year of college, which was unusual for that time. So obviously my father had no intention ever of going back on the farm. He probably couldn't have gone back as a matter of disability, physical disability as a result of the war anyway. But there was no inclination on his part to go back to the farm. People tried to leave the farm. They didn't try to go back to it.
Were there any places that your parents wouldn't let you go to as a child that they would restrict from you?
In Lair, I can't think of anything that a 10-year-old couldn't do.
Okay. How about in Fargo when you moved to Fargo?
In Fargo, no, I don't think that we were given a certain amount of freedom that, you can't go to bars or anything like that when you're that age, and we could go to movies if we had the dime or so that it took to get into the movie. But we were basically allowed to leave in the morning and come home and eat at lunch and leave again and come home and eat in the dinner and go out again and play and come home at bedtime.
Were there any children that your parents discouraged you from socializing with?
None that I can know.
Okay.
There might have been parents that didn't want their children to play with the Fercho boys, but I don't remember the Fercho boys being told they couldn't play with somebody else.
You talked about the founding of Lair. Do you want to, before the interview, do you want to talk a little bit about that now?
My maternal grandfather was named Andreas Lair. He donated 40 acres for the Lair town site as a part of his farm. So that's where that came from, and the city was, I think, incorporated or started in 1898. So, but that's where the name came. It came from my maternal grandfather. I understand he wasn't a real nice guy either, is what I understand.
Really?
That's right.
You said the population was about 500?
It was about 500, and when we left there in the early 30s, and now it is trying to remain at 100. Like every small town, it is probably 20–25% of what it has been. The small towns, if they aren't a county seat or don't have a nursing home or something major, don't have a chance to continue at this day.
Do you know if the population of Blair right now is predominantly German Russian still?
Still, yes. Mm-hmm.
How many churches were in there? Was it just one church?
When I was growing up, we had 3 churches.
Okay.
There was the Evangelical Church, which was the church we attended. There was the Baptist Church, and there was the Seventh-day Adventist. And we practically didn't even marry into either one of those. I mean, right, stayed with themselves. The Baptists stayed with themselves. The Seventh-day Adventists did, and it's all. And now they have 4 churches now, for 100 people.
Oh my!
And they're not well attended.
Are they still the Evangelical, the Baptist?
Now it's the Methodist, the Lutheran, the Seventh-day Adventist, and the Baptist.
Okay. How large was your congregation when you were a child?
I'm going to say that it was probably the larger church in the community, so we might have several hundred. It was really a quite active group then because it had more members than either of the other 2 churches.
When you came to Fargo, how large was your congregation at the church you attended here?
Probably 100 or so. It was not a large church.
Do you remember what church that was that you attended?
It was called the Evangelical Church also, and it was at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 10th Street South. It's now an apartment house. And
what church are you attending currently?
we're Methodists.
Methodist. Okay. What were the town's kids when you lived in Lair? What were the town's kids' feelings about farm kids? Was there a different?
There was no feeling one direction or another. I think that as a general rule, the children in town were more English language oriented. The rural children were more German language oriented. And this gradually diminished as they progressed in their education, so that maybe by the 5th or 6th grade it was more equivalent.
When you moved to Fargo, that transition, you, you did do you feel you were started to be seen as more of a farm kid when you came to Fargo, even though you were
Right,
a
right.
town
You know,
kid?
you maintain these your language, uh, your the manner of speaking. About 10 years ago, my daughter had an au pair from Germany, and I was speaking with her, talking with her on the telephone, and she said, "Your father has a German accent." Now, you have to understand, I'm 50 years away from there, but,
Yep.
but you maintain a little bit of your childhood language the rest of your life.
We've talked about uh, the different ethnic groups or the lack of diversity in Lair. When you moved to Fargo, um, was there a greater population of non-German Russians around you?
There were very few German Russians here. You have to understand, Fargo is a Scandinavian community. It's a Catholic community, but German Russian, besides our own little church group, was probably, there were not too many.
So how was that transition from you as far as your culture moving into a non-German Russian community, a non-Protestant?
Within a year or two, there's no difference. There's no difference.
Okay. What was the relationship between, did you see any difference when your parents moved from Lair to here with how they were treated by Fargo residents? Were they also treated as farm people, so to say?
No, no. My parents weren't. When my grandparents moved to Fargo, see, my grandmother didn't learn to speak English till she was 65 years of age. But she learned English at that time because if you want to talk to your neighbors, you better learn to speak English, which she did.
Out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You talked about participating in basketball. Did you participate in any other type of cultural events during your childhood years in Fargo?
I was in sports and basketball, and baseball. Decent, good student, I think, in high school. Not straight A's, but the potential for that.
Describe a typical Saturday night. What would you do on a Saturday evening?
At what age?
Well, let's start first with your younger childhood years.
Well, Saturday night wasn't any different than anything else. The community was different. I understand, because the community, everybody came to town on Saturday. They came, this is when they did their weekly shopping. That's when they brought the eggs in to sell, to take something else home and so forth. But I don't think our Saturday nights later on were any different from anything else. As I say, we didn't have any TV. It seems to me that when I was in Lair, the only time I heard a radio was when a big boxing match was going on, and somehow I suspect we had a radio at home, but we didn't listen to it except for special events.
When you were later in life in Fargo, were Saturday nights a little different for you, or?
No, I don't think Saturday night was anything special for us. You have to understand, my parents had a hard time just keeping ends together and making to do and keeping the family going and so forth. There was no Saturday night entertainment. Weekends were sort of, if anything else, they were sort of getting ready for Sunday, resting. The weekends were for, Sunday and Saturday were for resting, not for playing.
Okay. What are some of the positive aspects of growing up in a small town?
aren't that many positives. I suppose you could. You have to understand, you grow up in a small town, your school is not going to be as good as it is in a larger city. Your options for entertainment are far less when you don't have a movie theater, when you don't have a library. So I can't, the only one advantage I could see is that there's more of a freedom for the children to go out and go about the town as they want to. Less anxiety among the parents for what their children are doing than you would have in a large city. But advantages, I can't think of particularly any real advantages.
Something I've run into with talking about small towns is there's always characters or interesting people within the town. Do you remember any characters in your town?
We had not that many. We had one or two that were, I might say, not feeble-minded, but they were not quite as good as others, and they acted a little bit differently. I don't remember any bad characters or so from the town at that time. I don't have any bad memories of bad people.
We're going to transition into some school memories. We'll start with Lair because that's your early years. Would you say did you attend a one-room schoolhouse, or was it more of a country school that had different classes, different grade levels? Or?
The school that I attended on Lair, as I recall, had 4 large rooms. Okay. One room was first, second, and third grade. The next room was fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. Then it was like 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then they had a high school room.
Oh, okay.
It had a small gym, small gymnasium, playground, and so forth. Actually, we had 2 schools, 2 grade schools in this small town. And the reason being is that the town was located in 2 different counties. So half of the city, about 60% of the city was located in McIntosh County, so they had to have their school system. And then Logan County had to have another school system for the first 8 grades, and then the high school they combined. Then I think there were probably about a dozen children in my grade, maybe not quite 8 to 10, somewhere like that. And the teacher would have like maybe 25 or 30 students in that one room in 3 different grades.
Was the school population similar to the town population as far as primarily German Russian or all German Russian?
It would be the same people. A lot of the first graders, so forth, came to school unable to speak English because they probably had not had any English spoken in their home. But a good place to learn the language was on the playground.
When you were out on the playground, then you spoke English?
Depends upon who you're with. So if you're good, when you're bilingual, it doesn't make any difference which language you're using.
I imagine since you said education was important to your parents that you regularly attended school.
Oh yes,
And your
school.
brothers as well.
Yeah, right. As we grew up, we were always directed toward college education. There's no doubt about that. That was a goal. Had to do it.
Did they ever pull you out for any reason to help around the house? Or
No.
They really emphasized
No.
everything. Okay.
There was plenty of opportunity to help around the house without being pulled out of school.
Was attendance a problem for other students in your school? Did you see a fluctuating attendance, or was everybody?
Not really, because when I lived there, I was in the first 5 grades, and you don't take a 5th grader out of school to do work. And I don't recall my older brother, who remained there till he was through the 9th grade, having to do that. Now, probably in the country schools it might have been different, but not in the sphere that I was raised in.
Do you remember your teachers?
I remember one teacher very definite influence on me. Her name was Miss Van Orney, and she was just the ultimate in teaching. She loved her students. She loved to teach, and I had the opportunity many years later, when I was an eye specialist in Fargo, to treat her and her husband as patients, and that happened to me a number of times that I would do a cataract operation on one of my former teachers, and it always sort of made me feel good that they chose me to do their surgery.
Quite an honor. That's great. Did you have homework when you were in your younger years in Lair? Did your teachers assign homework?
I presume they did because when you're teaching 3 classes, maybe 5 subjects or so in each one, you can't spend very much time with a student at all. So homework was always, it's always there with you.
When you went home to do your homework, did your brothers help you? Did your parents help you with it, or did you primarily do it by yourself?
By ourselves. I don't remember getting much help from parents.
Did you have enough time to do your homework with the chores you had to do?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Remember, there was no television.
Yeah.
No radio. You get a lot of time when you don't have TV.
Nothing to distract you. What types of activities did you do at recess? Your recess hour?
You have the things on the playground. You have swings, you have merry-go-rounds, you have the tag games or so forth of various kinds that you would play. That's about all. That's what was available. And that's what you did.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, this is a really embarrassing question, I suppose. I had a love for horses when I grew up. And I suspect that my first real goal in life was to be a singing cowboy or something like that. But I got over that. And when I was in high school, I think I probably wanted to be a professional baseball player. But that didn't work out very well either. So as I had a sort of a semi-scientific courses, and as soon as I finished high school, I registered in pre-med at North Dakota State University.
How many students did you say were in your grade level, in your class?
In where?
In Lair.
I'd say maybe 10 or so at the max.
How many students were in the school, the entire school, would you say?
Oh, maybe 80, 90 students.
School for
Yeah, but just 12 grades.
Yeah. When you moved to Fargo, what grade were you in?
6th grade.
6th grade. And how was that, the composition of that school? Were there more males, females?
About equal. It was Jefferson, which is no longer a school now. I think it has been changed into something else. But we were sort of in a mixed economic area. We had some of the wealthier families in that school, and we also had some of the poorer families. But kids don't know the difference when they're in 6th grade, 7th grade.
What grades did that school go through? Was that through high school?
That was a grade school going through the 6th grade.
Through 6th grade.
At that time, Fargo had, then the junior high schools were 7th, 8th, and 9th, and the high school was 10, 11, and 12.
What junior high school did you go to?
I went to Roosevelt Junior High School on the north side of town.
Okay. And then,
We moved from the south side to the north side during that period.
okay. And then for high school, you went to?
We had Central High School in Fargo. We only had one high school at that time. I think the high school burned down about 1968 or so.
When you went to high school, were there more males or females, or was it still about the same?
Pretty much equal, I think.
What types of subjects do you remember being taught while you were in Lair?
Well, I presume it was like the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic to a great extent, because I remember I still have a little Palmer method in my penmanship, because penmanship was actually we were taught how to write. You see, history, geography, probably a little government, uh, mathematics, you know, at that level. I think very basic. You couldn't offer anything different. You had to be very basic in a school where you have the one teacher and three grades.
The teachers, do you know if they had, what level of education they had? Were they college trained or did...
At that time, that if you had like 2 years of college, that would be more than adequate to teach a lower level. A lot of teachers were not college graduates. They had probably what they call teacher certificates, but not necessarily, they didn't have comparable education. You had to learn, hopefully know a little bit more than your students, and that was about what was the main requirement.
Did the teachers speak German as well?
The school, there was no German in the school. Everything was English. Everything is, and I think a lot of the teachers did not speak German. But there were no special education classes for children who didn't speak the basic languages we have today, which I don't agree with.
When you went to school, what did you take for lunch?
In Lair, you have to remember no one lived much more than about 3-4 blocks from home, so everybody went home to eat.
Okay.
I don't remember ever taking lunch to school. Winter, summer, anytime.
Just went home and had...
Yeah.
Did you have lunch then with your mother and father, or was it just your mother, or...
Well, I'm not sure that my father came home for lunch because he was the postmaster and was all alone in there, and so I presume that he probably carried his lunch, but mother was always home.
Let's see. Which schools did you like better? Did you like going to school out in Lair better than when you transitioned into Fargo, or were they about the same as just school?
I think we like Fargo better. You know, it's there were more in your class than there were there. You had more individual teaching than we had there. So I think the two school systems are, you can't compare a country school with a city school.
Do you remember any of your teachers from your years in the Fargo school?
Oh yes, yes, I very much remember. I remember one of my art teachers. I remember my algebra teacher in like 8th or 9th grade, Miss Duffy, did a cataract operation on her later on. Grant Seifert at Fargo was again a math teacher, did cataract operations on him later on. And I remember some of the teachers. I remember a handicap teacher we had who had a lot of difficult from birth injuries, who taught one of the social studies. And I remember my history teacher, Mr. Vabrina, who later on taught me some French when I went to work in a mission in Haiti in 1962.
Would you say, either in Lair or in Fargo, would you say the teachers were strict?
Teachers were strict those days.
How would they discipline children that...
Probably with a ruler or something like that. I mean, there was no. The teachers were strict. You had to be very attentive. You had to pay attention. The principal of the high school would be, if you were out of line, you went to the principal's office and you were either suspended or disciplined in some way. They didn't have that many problems because the children were accustomed to discipline throughout their whole education system. We didn't have drugs.
Did you ever get into any trouble when you were in school?
Good question.
Gotta get the other side of Calvin Fercho here.
Well, I did get into trouble one time, I remember, and that is when we were in junior high, we had a baseball field near us, and we decided that it would be nice if we excavated a part of that public field to make a dugout like they did in the real baseball world. And for that, we were brought to juvenile court for doing that. And, of course, it was dismissed, but it wasn't the world's greatest thing. I didn't really get into much trouble when I grew up.
What did your parents think about your run-in with the...
Nothing much. That was not a bad thing to do.
Did it scare you a little bit when
No.
you had to go to juvenile court?
You don't want to go to be in front of the police woman at that time. They had one woman that would do those things.
Okay. Was there any morals or way of life that teachers emphasized as a goal for children to reach for?
I don't think it was any different then than it was now. I think the home was very dependent upon it. I think that many of my friends, and I like to tell a story about my basketball team, because I've always been a rather supporter of sports. And my high school basketball team, if I can just tell you a little bit about them.
Yeah, go ahead.
And we had, on the first five, we had a guard that became a contractor in California. Another guard became a vice president of Pfizer. The center became president of the largest advertising firm in Chicago. The other forward with me became a principal at Edina. That was my career. For the substitutes, one of the forwards became the basketball coach at the University of Arizona. The other forward became a lawyer in Fargo. One of the substitute guards is a physician in Iowa. Another substitute guard was the president of a Northern States Power Unit in Montevideo, Minnesota. Another one was an executive with Ford Motor Company. And one of our student managers was Mark Andrews, U.S. Senator.
Oh my. So success. Reach for success.
And I sort of was proud of that, and I thought...
That is something to be very proud of. Most definitely. When there were children of different social backgrounds or ethnicities in school, did teachers treat them any differently?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think in high school, we didn't have a great deal of intervention of parents with their children, for example, in their teams that they played in school and things like that. Parents were pretty much, the children did their thing, the parents did their thing, and it was different then. Now, your 10-year-old son might be playing hockey in Minneapolis, and you have to take him to Minneapolis one week, or they play soccer in some other big city. It's entirely different. The children did their thing, the parents did theirs.
Okay. Did you read, what books do you remember reading, if any, while you were at school? Like, I mean, not like your textbooks, but like...
I did a lot of, when I was in junior high school, I was a very frequent visitor at the Fargo Public Library. I liked to read historical fiction, and always had a book that I was reading.
Did you celebrate the holidays in school? Like, it's a custom today, just, to have like Valentine's Day parties where kids exchange Valentine's cards. Did you do anything like that?
I think we did the Valentine's part, but I think that's probably the only thing that I can see, because I don't recall like Halloween being anything, but Valentine's Day was, but mostly that would be little things that we may create ourselves.
Okay. I think we've talked about how important it was to get an education in your family, so we'll move to teenage years and dating. How old were you when you started dating?
I think I had my first date when I was probably about in the 8th grade or so. Her name was Dorothy Schwartz. She still lives in Fargo. We still remind each other of it.
Was it a bad experience?
Oh no, not at all. But again, she was in our church. We would do those things, and I didn't date a great deal in high school. I was more of a basketball, sporting type of guy. We didn't do much of that. Maybe went to a prom or so, but didn't have a girlfriend.
What was a typical date like back then?
A typical date would be probably to go to a movie, not rather than anything else.
When you went to movies, what movies did you usually go and see?
If when we were younger, we would go to the cowboy movies, and when you were, I don't really recall maybe more than one time taking a girl to the movies when I was in high school.
Okay.
I'm sorry to give that. I don't have a great social situation at that level, but I didn't.
What was your favorite movie when you were growing up? Did you have one of those old country westerns that just stick out in your head?
We'd have to go back to, I think, to the cowboy movies when I was because that's what we could afford. That was a dime. Not only that, they'd have these movies that would have these sequels in them. That every week there'd be another bad thing that was just about ready to happen. So you'd come back the next week to see how this group was doing.
Draws you in for the next one.
Right.
Okay. Did you, in your young adult years, did you attend any parties or social gatherings that it would encourage dating or?
I don't think anything special. When you go to college, you have the people you meet there, and I don't think so. Again, it seems to me that the girls I dated often were the ones that I met in church or something like that. Not that I'm trying to give such a religious tone to this, but that's what you did.
What was your family's feelings towards dance halls?
My parents were rather fundamental in their Christianity, and dancing was not something that I suppose we were allowed to do it, but it wasn't encouraged.
Okay.
Cards would be allowed, but not encouraged. Drinking would be not encouraged at all, but they knew that by the time we got to college, you have to remember, by the time I got to college, I'd been in the Army for 3 years. Now, my sense of values are a lot different when I come back from the Army than when I go to the Army.
How would you say that changed you? I mean, what things did you notice that changed when you came back?
Well, you're different, You're different when you've been to war over in Germany and things like that. When you come home, you're a different 20-year-old than the person who never left. Never left. But most of my friends did leave. There were very few of us that remained at home during the war. Now, we came home also, though when I did return home, I was very interested in my college education. And when you work 15, 20 hours a week and go to college, you don't have much time for anything else. And I didn't have the finances to go out and do a lot of socializing anyway.
How did you pay for college?
Having been in the Army for 2.5 years, I had education provided for me by the government to the extent of about 42 months of education, where they would give me like about $50 a month and my tuition.
Okay.
This was called the GI Bill of Rights, and it provided an education for many of us. Although I went to college for about 6.5 years, I had to sometimes use my GI Bill, then not use it. Use it, not use it, so that by the time I graduated from medical school, I had just running out of it.
It's a good way to manage it.
Right.
Was there a community meeting place for people in your town to socialize?
Not at that time. Not in Lair, North Dakota, there wasn't. You had the school, you had the church. It had to be one or the other.
What did you learn at home from your parents about married life?
Well,
What the responsibilities of being a husband?
I would say this, that we were encouraged to marry Protestants.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we tended, as I grew up, we tended not to date Catholic girls. In fact, I usually asked on the first date what church you go to, and if she's just in an offhand way, and if she said Catholic, well, she didn't expect me to call her again for the second date. But I think that it wasn't strong in our family, but it was a sort of a feeling that that's what you did.
Okay.
That's what you did.
Did you end up marrying a Protestant?
Yes.
Was she German Russian?
Unfortunately not.
What did the church teach you about marriage?
I don't know. I think we have the old fundamental things about, the Ten Commandments and so forth. But I'd say most of our things were examples in our own home rather than from the church, because you're rather resistant at that age to any church teachings anyway, to a great extent.
Food.
Food.
Who usually prepared the meals in your families?
Mother.
Mother.
100%.
Did the men ever help in the kitchen?
My father never helped in the kitchen. As boys, we did. My older brother and I always did the dishes every evening. And that was just expected, that the two of us would do the dishes.
Now, did your mother make some really good German food?
We had the usual German food. If you want me to go into the details of it, I can.
That'd be great.
A lot of the German food at that time was flour-based. By that I mean dumplings, strudels, and some of it had a Russian name. These things were brought over from Russia, like Krautkombuschka. That's a German. It's a common. The first half of that is German. The second half is Russian, and that is, for example, you take cabbage leaves and you make a combination of rice, hamburger, maybe a little pepper or so, and you put it in that. They call it pigs in a blanket now.
Okay.
For your more modern name. Kuchen was a very big thing, and every Saturday my grandmother made a bunch of kuchen, and you'd stop and you'd pick up some. Mother baked bread all the time, and knepfler would be another one. In fact, I noticed that we have a Chores kitchen in Fargo now that has knepfler soup.
I see the advertisements.
And I go over there for that once in a while, but it's
Tasty?
It's different than what I grew up with, but it's dough balls, and dough was used in just because flour was the basic, The farmers would take some sacks of wheat, take them to the elevator, and come home with some flour for it. You see, it was a barter system type of thing. A lot of sauerkraut was mixed in with many things. I still love sauerkraut. My grandfather, every fall, they would butcher a steer and some hogs and make the meat for the winter.
Did your mother do a lot of canning?
Mother did a lot of canning. She canned lots of pickles, lots of corn, peas, beans. We lived off canned goods almost all year round.
And your father did the butchering?
My father didn't.
Oh,
My
your
grandfather did it.
Did they have butchering parties or
No, you just not much. Whatever help was needed, which would maybe only be about two, 3 people could do everything.
Did you ever help with that?
As a 10-year-old, I'd help. We all had our little duties, you know.
What about sausage making? Did you make your own sausage?
We made the sausage, and grandfather made the sausage, and the sausage was made, and the casings were made from what was left over from the butchering process. You didn't buy casings at the store. You created them out of the small intestine of the animal.
When you had your meals, did you sit down at a family table and eat them together?
We always ate at a family table, and I still remember them at my little German prayer that we used to say at that before we ate.
You remember that?
Oh, sure.
Did you recite it for us?
It went something like that. Aber lieber Vater, Amen. Which is what we said. And Abba is a old Christian name for father. Liebe is love. Then father, of course, is father. And then the usual closure, Amen. My grandparents were named Amen. A-M-A-N. That was their name on my mother's side. She was an Amen. And I remember one time my mother said several times as a child, I asked, why do we say Amen instead of Fercho when we finish the prayer?
That would be a cute. How'd your mother respond to that?
I don't know, just telling you, I don't remember, but sometimes our parents tell us things about ourselves as children that we don't remember ourselves, which is nice.
Were you allowed to talk over the meals? Was it a time for family discussion, or were they usually silent meals that you ate and then you were done?
I think eating and being done is about what it amounts to,
Okay. What were your favorite food? What was your favorite food that your mother used to make for you?
Ham, corn, sauerkraut. That was it.
And for dessert?
Oh, dessert, cake probably. We made pies. Rhubarb pie was very definitely right up in there.
What about your least favorite meal? Something you just dreaded to see on the table?
Liver. Because my father was the only one that liked it, was only served maybe once a year.
Oh, clothing. You've talked about how your mother, you made clothing out of your dad's old suits. Was that something traditional, or?
I wouldn't call it more of a tradition. I would call it more of an economy measure.
Okay.
That you would reuse the parts of your father's suit that weren't worn out and cut them into pieces and create a suit for little fellows.
Today they talk about fads, something being in style. Were there any type of fads that existed when you were a child or young?
I don't think so. I think that the clothing that we wore, I'd say the bib overhaul was what we wore to school. Was what a lot of men had a brand new pair of overalls, and they wore them to church or for funerals. And that's the only thing I can think of clothing. From the little girls or so, I can't think of. My daughters would be caught dead trying to dress their little boys in clothes my mother dressed me in for family photographs, because we looked like little Lloyd Fauntleroy in pants.
Do you remember when your family got electricity?
We always had electricity in our home, right? Because we lived in the community in town. So I don't remember. Electricity we always had. Indoor plumbing we didn't always have. In Lair, we did not have a sewer system when I was living there. That came up maybe about 30 years later. And so we had our facilities outside, maybe, 20, maybe 30 yards from the back door was your toilet facility.
When you moved to Fargo, did you have indoor plumbing then?
Well, when Fargo was a different situation.
Was that a nice luxury to move into?
It's always a nice luxury, especially in cold weather.
Yeah, I can imagine that one. Did your family have a telephone when you were growing up?
No.
Do you remember when you got your first telephone?
I suppose when we came to Fargo, the number was 5721.
Did that make a big difference in your life, having that, or?
Well, we didn't use the phone very much. The phone was something that Mother would use to call somebody else. As for ourselves, we didn't, as children, we didn't use the phone for anything. You didn't call somebody to go playing or something much. You just appeared at the playground in the evening or in the afternoon. Everybody else did. You didn't call each other, you're going to go this or going that.
What about a radio? You talked about how you may have had a radio, but it was only on special occasions.
I don't recall a family radio when we lived in Lair. I do remember my father listening to some boxing matches in the 30s, but other than that, I don't remember that we had. I think we did have later on a radio, but I don't think we listened to it very much.
And what about a television? When did you get your first television?
My first introduction to TV was, I think, in about 1950 when I lived in Chicago. Okay. And the first one that my wife and I had was, I think, in 1956 or 1953 when I was an intern in Chicago.
How did that change your life?
Watches. You want to see the television? It's sitting right in the next room. My first TV from Chicago is sitting in this room next door.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, we should get a picture of that. Well, let's move on to some concluding questions, and then we'll take some photos, and we'll let you get on with your day. What was the most stressful childhood experience that you ever lived through?
Childhood experience? I think the fire that I mentioned earlier was certainly one. I remember the severe illness one of my younger brothers had. Other than that, I can't think of any. We had a basically happy family, within our family, so I can't think of anything really stressful.
What helped you get through that experience of seeing the young girl on fire?
Oh, I don't know. I think you don't carry that with you all that much. You remember it, but remember we didn't have any counselors to go to because you'd been traumatized by something like that. Your family was your support. Your parents were your support.
Did you talk to them about that a lot?
I don't recall. I don't think that it was just an event.
Just something you lived with?
Yeah, it's an event.
Okay. What was the most scariest thing that you ever experienced?
When?
During your childhood.
Oh, during my childhood. I don't remember. I do remember I had my uncle that I used to go with, who was a sort of a practical joker, and would maybe come and rap on our window when we were out at the farm and act like it was somebody trying to get in the house or so. He always tried to frighten us in a fun sort of way. But I didn't have any real scary situations.
Okay. And what was the happiest thing during your childhood that you experienced?
That's a very good question. I don't remember any really specific events. I think we had some nice family experiences, like a trip to British Columbia when I was like 7 years old. And my father liked to take trips in a car with the family, and we'd drive forever, and I stay wherever we could. And but I thought those were sort of fun experiences, and I do remember them from like say when I was 7 years old.
And what was the most adventurous thing that you did during your childhood?
I think a friend of mine and I, just as 13-year-olds, getting out on the highway and hitchhiking to Detroit Lakes and putting up a tent and being there for 3 days and coming home again, maybe having $1 between the two of us for food or so. I thought that was sort of a mini adventure that for that age group.
Why do you think it's important to tell your life story?
Well, you know, I wish that I had asked my father more questions about his youth, about his family life, that we would have gone together just 10 miles out of town, and he'd have said, Calvin, here's the farm I grew up in, here's where I played as a child. And I never thought about those questions until it was too late and he wasn't there to answer them anymore. I think it's important to leave a legacy of your life to your children, especially if you're not ashamed of it. I don't have to be ashamed of mine. And I'd like to share that with them so that maybe someday that my grandchildren would have more than one photo of Grandpa like what I have.
And are there any other thoughts or observations you would like to share with us today?
I think that in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe through the German-Russian Historical Society, and I do have a second cousin who is very prominent in the German-Russian Society. Her name is Margaret Freeman. And you probably know Margaret. Margaret lives in Redondo Beach, California. But when we grew up, we were sort of almost ashamed of who we were, where we came from. And I'm pleased to see that this has changed, that we have a rather bit of a pride in our heritage. My wife thinks there is nobody like a German-Russian woman for getting things done. And I think those of us who grew up in hard times, we have a definite work ethic. And I sort of attribute that to my German-Russian heritage. And it certainly hasn't hurt me in my life. And I think we think back more to now. Maybe we have to thank the Haley of the Roots tradition for getting all of us to look back a little bit.
Most definitely.
And but I have good feelings about the way I was raised, my parents and my grandparents.
I have one quick question to throw in there. We've talked about your wife, but you've never said how you met her. So how did you meet your wife?
I met my wife when an old high school classmate of mine came back to Fargo, and we double dated. He used to live next to my wife, and so he dated my wife, and I dated somebody else, and got to know my wife, asked her out, and a couple years later we were married.
And how long have you been married now?
We will be married 53 years on June 24th. We were married in 1952. My brother and me, and I presume that I am probably about 2, and my brother's about 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of the door at our house in Lair. This is my mother as a child. with her two
And
with
this
two of her
is-
5 sisters.
Okay.
And here is a very handsome, good-looking little fellow
Is it
who
you?
looks like like he might be about 2 years old, sitting on a piano bench. I have another photograph somewhere with me when I was about 6 years old, and I think I'm standing at the same bench again.
Looks like you are a very happy child. Nice big grin.
Here's my college graduation photograph.
Okay.
Handsome guy.
Yes, most definitely.
I don't have many more. I had, where's that one of the house?
The house.
Where we had us in front of the house. That one.
This one here?
No. And this is, you might want to get those closer.
Yeah, we'll take a
yeah.
digital level.
But anyway, this taken in 1931. I'm 6. My older brother is about 10 at the time. And it shows everybody dressed up in their Sunday clothes. My older brother seems to have a nice new pair of clean overalls on.
With his nice little tie underneath.
Nice little tie underneath.
And
I'm
then-
sorry I don't have more photographs, but I don't
this
have
is
much
great.
in
And
that
then-
line.
And then this here is like at a lake.
This is a lake, but I don't remember very much about.
On the back.
Oh, here we got one in the back. This is my grandfather, my father's father, and this is one of the. Must be done in, I'm going to say, maybe in the late 20s or something like that.
Okay.
Mid-20s. I can tell by the sign of the car. This is just my father and his brother, and I don't even remember when, probably in the 1950s or so, or 1940s.
And then this is right before you went off to World War II.
That's the day I left for the Army. Here's a photograph of me in the service. Here's my older brother in the service, me in the Army, my father.
And your brother was in the Navy, right?
Yeah, he was in the Navy.
Okay. And this was a copy.
Yeah.
And then what do we have here?
This is our family at my brother's lake home. Myself, one brother here, one brother's not there, but
You can't tell
some
the
of the
family
children.
resemblance.
No.
And
This
then-
is John that you met before. You know.
And then these are some of the grandkids.
These are some of the grandchildren.
He looks like he's a pride and joy.
Yeah, these two.
Oh, he looks like a handful as well.
Right.